So Ontario is going the wrong way. Instead of opening up more businesses, Ontario today announced massive new restrictions for Toronto, for Ottawa, and for the Peel region, and tough new penalties for violators. Failure to comply, you got to get ready to hand over $10,000. If you're hosting one of these illegal gatherings, $10,000. $750 if you're attending those. But if you're an indoor gathering, they're just restricted to 10. But as Andrea Horwath, who's going to join us later, the NDP leader in Ontario, just asked on that clip, how if classrooms are going to allow 30 kids or buses have 40 kids and indoor gatherings are restricted to 10? Now, we did ask the Ontario Premier Doug Ford to join us today. He declined. So did the Health Minister, Christine Elliott. They weren't available to come on. But to get reaction, now the Ontario NDP leader, Andrea Horwath, joins us. Andrea Horwath, great to have you here. Do you buy that this is the right approach, given the surge, that the Premier is right to roll back the opening back to essentially phase 2 and these recent restrictions?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of like a last resort for the Premier because they've done so poorly when it comes to the response to COVID-19. It seems this government just hasn't been able to get ahead of this virus. They have been, coming in to fix crises that they've allowed to occur. And you've named a couple of them: the school chaos that we're dealing with, the testing lines that we have. The government has not been very clear at all with its communications. It's been mixed messages from day one. And so now, as a last resort, they're putting these fines in place. But it's a problem here in Ontario.
Fair, I just want to separate some issues. Sure. Doctors are not saying that the school, and I want to separate the school. The schools haven't caused the spike, okay? The spike has maybe caused from other gatherings 2 weeks ago. What, in your mind, could or should he have done differently to stop this surge, or was the surge inevitable because, people are sick of it?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to unpack here, but I think it's important that your viewers know that there are 62 schools now that have COVID-19 cases in them. We've had one school close in Ontario just the other day. And so I think there is a problem in schools, Evan. And I think that there's also definitely a problem in terms of the way that the government has dealt with this pandemic from day one. Mr. Ford has been all about do as I say, not as I do. So that's created confusion for people. There's no doubt that there's fatigue out there. But when the premier's, in photos on the internet at a wedding with no mask on, and yet he tells people you can go to weddings, but you have to keep distanced and you have to keep your masks on, that's a problem. When he tells people, don't go to the cottage, and then he goes to the cottage. But I mean, there's a reason why people think it's okay to let down their guard, and that's because they're seeing the Premier do the exact same thing.
Okay, just to be fair, the first school in Ontario that did close in Pembroke because of COVID-19, the allegation is that there was a teacher or 3 teachers that had symptoms and came to school with symptoms and no mask. So that was the teacher's issue, not the government's issue, allegedly. But I want to talk about schools, because you had a vote today to try to cap the number of students in the class at 15. Now, what do you make of the fact that now there's restrictions of indoor gatherings down to 10, but you've got classrooms, and there's parents talking to me all day on the radio today saying, I got 30 kids in my kid's class. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, again, this is what makes people confused. I mean, how can it be that we are restricting indoor gatherings to 10 people, and yet our schools have, in some cases, 30, 35 kids in the classroom? Our buses have 65, 70 kids, cheek by jowl, crammed into those buses, in some cases from 5 different schools and 2 different school boards. So this is what I'm saying, that, I mean, the government's really failed when it comes to education. They put together, a bargain basement plan to pinch pennies on the backs of our kids. And now we're seeing, the result of this. And rightfully, parents are
what do you say
horrified.
To the argument? What do you say to
Parents
the
are
argument
horrified.
That you're comparing apples and oranges? Like, schools are safeguarded. They've got proper social distancing, the government says. Students are supposed to wear masks. They're staying in their cohort. That's not happening at, unmonitored social settings like bars or parties. So you can't compare schools to other indoor gatherings. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, quite on the contrary. I mean, I just gave an example of school buses where the cohorts are all mixed, and in fact, two different school boards are being bused by the same bus, and all of those kids are intermingling. So it's not the case that's happening in schools. And look, how does an education worker, a teacher, and maybe an EA deal with a classroom of, let's say, 28 little ones in kindergarten, 30 little ones in kindergarten, and try to get them to all be washing their hands when they're supposed to, all keeping their masks on, not sharing pencils or crayons, not sharing snacks or lunches. I mean, I think it's pretty naive to think that cramming 30 kids in a classroom is going to be safe no matter what. And that's why sick kids was really. But this is what the experts are saying, though. Evan, let's not forget. I'm not talking about what the government's trying to claim or their talking points. I'm talking about what Sick Kids has said very clearly. A maximum of 12 to 15 kids in a classroom is what they've recommended, and that's not new. For weeks and weeks and weeks, experts have been saying the same thing.
I spoke to Harvey Bischoff today. He's the head of the Toronto District School Board. And I said, I don't get this, because I know my kids are in school. You've got empty classrooms on one side.
Exactly.
And you've got kids who are in cohorts that are collapsed classes, so grade 7 and 8 are mixed, grade 5 and 6 are mixed, 30 kids in one class, then an empty classroom. So why are there empty classrooms? The unions are saying we need more money for teachers. The government's saying we gave you emergency money for teachers. You guys should have reallocated it yourself.
Well, I mean, in fact, what they did was provide about $16,000 per school, which is not nearly enough to even hire a third of an education worker, a teacher, for example. But look, I mean, what we saw is the government say, go ahead and dip into your reserves. So depending on how much reserves each board had would determine how much extra financing that the boards could do internally. That's just not good enough. The government's sitting on $6.7 billion of emergency COVID funding that they identified, right, that they set aside, and they're not investing in the increase in numbers of locations for teaching to happen, for teachers to be hired. They didn't solve the busing problem, and now it's become exacerbated to the point where literally every day the kids are finding out at the last minute that their bus route has been canceled. And so it's all about funding. And we know what the Conservatives are all about. Look, they were cutting education funding before the COVID pandemic hit. They were cutting teaching positions. That may be true, but they haven't cut it during it.
Okay, it's true. That's fair.
But what they have done, Evan, and this is what
money now since the pandemic.
But what they have done is exactly what Harvey is talking about, and that is that they've left in place the requirement that when class sizes get to a small number, you have to collapse the classes. And so what's the point of that? Parents were thinking that their kids were going to be going back to smaller classes because a lot of parents were keeping their kids home to do the online learning. But instead of allowing that to happen and that, that online learning to kind of cull the number of kids in each class, the government has left the requirement in place that you have to collapse the classes to make them large classes again, which, as you describe what Mr. Bischoff said, is exactly what's happening. On the front, we've heard stories from parents who find out on Friday their kid is in a class of 18, and they're thinking, oh, okay, that's not bad. And then they show up on Monday to school, and there's 28 kids in the class.
Well,
and then parents have to scramble.
It's happening real time. It's a really ongoing difficulty for a lot of parents right now. Andrea Horwath, I got to leave it there. NDP leader in Ontario in the midst of this. She wants to cap class size at 15. All right. Thank you so much, Andrea Horwath.